The ballroom at Ashfield House had been dressed within an inch of its life. 300 candles burned in the chandeliers overhead, their light fracturing against crystal and polished silver, until the entire room seemed to vibrate with a manufactured warmth. Garlands of white roses ran the length of each window. The orchestra occupied the far corner, with the resigned professionalism of men who had learned long ago that the music was not the point. Everywhere Penelope Ashworth looked, something was performing its own beauty. The gowns, the jewels, the carefully arranged laughter of women who had prepared their expressions the way a general prepares a field. The evening belonged to Lady Cecily Fairmont, who stood at the centre of it in ice-blue silk, her dark hair dressed with pearls, her smile so precisely calibrated that it managed to appear spontaneous to everyone, except Penelope, who had been watching it for 3 years. And at the edge of all that dazzling, orchestrated excess, checking the arrangement of a silver card tray no one else had touched in an hour, was Penelope Ashworth. She wore grey, not the fashionable dove grey of a woman making a deliberate choice, but a serviceable slate that had served 2 seasons already and was beginning to show its service at the cuffs. She had not been invited to this evening as a guest. She had been invited as a necessity, which was a different category entirely, and one she had occupied for long enough to know its precise dimensions. Her cousin Harriet, whose house this was, and whose entertainment budget Penelope had been quietly balancing for the past 4 years, had introduced her to the assembled company exactly once, at the beginning of the evening, and had not looked her direction since. Penelope was not troubled by this. She had the card tray, the seating arrangement folded in her left hand, and the knowledge that the third footman had placed Lord Weston's place card 2 seats too far to the left, which would produce an argument before the fish course if she did not correct it in the next 12 minutes. She had managed worse. The Duke of Cavendish arrived at 9:30, which was neither fashionably late nor conspicuously early, and the room recognised him the way rooms always recognised a duke. A slight shift in posture, a reorientation of attention, a ripple of social electricity that had nothing to do with the man himself, and everything to do with the title that arrived before him. He was tall and dark-coated, his cravat immaculate, his expression wearing the patient neutrality of a man completing an obligation he had agreed to before he fully understood its terms. He did not look dazzled. He did not look at Lady Cecily Fairmont with any particular distinction, though she arranged herself in his sightline with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent her entire adult life ensuring she was the first thing a duke noticed. What Edmund Cavendish, Duke of Cavendish, actually noticed was the woman in grey at the edge of the room, who was moving along the periphery with unhurried purpose, adjusting a place card on the seating arrangement table with the particular concentration of someone solving a real problem, while everyone else in the room was performing the performance of enjoying themselves. He watched her for 11 seconds, then his host arrived to claim him, and he permitted himself to be claimed. But he turned once, before he was drawn fully into the glittering machinery of the evening, and found that she had already moved on to the next necessary thing, and was not looking at him at all. It was the kind of attention he had not encountered in 3 years of these evenings, and it stayed with him in the way that useful things stay, not as a romantic observation, but as the quiet identification of something he did not yet have a category for. Penelope Ashworth had been managing other people's houses since she was 19 years old, and she had done it well enough that no one had ever found it necessary to thank her. Her father, William Ashworth, had been a man of considerable intelligence and catastrophic financial optimism. He had believed, with the genuine conviction of someone who has never been seriously corrected by reality, that the wool trade would recover, that the renegotiated creditor agreements would hold, and that the estate in Shropshire, Marlow House, 300 acres and a modest but serviceable income, would remain in the family if he simply persisted in optimism long enough to outlast the difficulty. He had not outlasted it. He had died of a chest fever in November of 1812, when Penelope was 18, leaving her a house in technical debt, a brother 8 years her junior, named Thomas, and no male relative willing to assume the estate's management without immediately extracting what he could and departing. Her uncle Gerard, her father's younger brother, had arrived within the week. He was a man who wore his good intentions like armor, loudly, visibly, and primarily as protection against any accusation of bad ones. He had sat across from Penelope in the morning room and explained, with great patience, that the estate was his to manage now, that she would of course remain in the house for as long as was practical, and that the accounts would be transferred to his care immediately. Penelope had listened to all of this and then said, very quietly, that she had been managing the accounts since her father's illness began 8 months prior, that she had already renegotiated 3 of the 7 outstanding creditor agreements, and that she would like to understand what specific deficiency in her management her uncle had identified that required his intervention. Gerard had not expected this. He was not a cruel man, simply an assumption-driven one. He had assumed the accounts were in ruins and was preparing to be magnanimous about inheriting a mess. The accounts were not in ruins. They were, in fact, organized with a precision that made his own solicitor, when he reviewed them 2 weeks later, use the word fastidious twice in the same sentence. The arrangement that resulted was not quite what Gerard had intended, and not quite what Penelope had hoped. He retained the legal authority of the estate. She retained the actual management of it. He drew a portion of the income. She kept Thomas in school. This was not an agreement that was written down anywhere, because writing it down would have required both parties to acknowledge what it actually was, and neither was prepared to do that. For 4 years, Penelope had run Marlow House and the adjacent tenant farms with the systematic attention of someone who understood that one missed creditor payment would undo 3 months of careful work. She kept 2 sets of accounts, one for Gerard, which was clear and straightforward and showed what he needed to see, and one for herself, which was annotated in the margins with every decision she had made and every alternative she had considered and rejected. The annotation was not vanity, it was evidence. She had understood from the beginning, with the clarity of someone who has very few illusions left to spend, that she might one day need to account for every shilling of the 4 years, and she intended to be able to do so. By the time Thomas turned 16 and came home for the holidays, the 3 outstanding creditor agreements had all been resolved. The tenant farms were producing. The roof of the east wing had been repaired with stone she had sourced at a figure 20% below what the original contractor had quoted, having negotiated the rate herself while Gerard was in Bath. The estate was not prosperous, but it was standing, and it was standing because she had decided, in the first winter after her father died, that she was not going to become less than she was. She had been cold that winter, not merely uncomfortable, genuinely, structurally cold, in the way of a house where the coal budget has been cut, and the person in charge of cutting it is the same person who feels the cold most acutely. She had sat at her father's desk one February morning, with her breath misting in the air above the account books, and had made a decision that she was not going to step aside for anyone, not for Gerard's convenient assumptions, not for the creditors who sent their letters in the tone of men who expected not to be answered, not for the quiet but pervasive social verdict that an unmarried woman in reduced circumstances was a problem waiting to be absorbed by someone else's household. She had pressed one hand briefly against the wall beside the desk, the cold stone of it, which was real and definite, and then she had returned to her accounts. When Gerard, 2 years into this arrangement, had moved her to Harriet's house in London, on the grounds that Harriet needed assistance and Penelope's presence at Marlow was, he said with great care, becoming something of an irregularity, she had packed the annotated account books and taken them with her. She had also taken Thomas's school records, the renegotiated creditor agreements, and a letter her father had written her on her 17th birthday that she did not read often but did not leave behind. Harriet's house was larger than Marlow and considerably more expensive, and managed with approximately half the attention. Penelope had been balancing Harriet's entertainment budget for 4 years. She had also, without being asked, reorganized the household accounts to eliminate a recurring overpayment to the coal merchant that had been running for 3 years, recovered the overpaid sum, in part through a credit negotiation she handled herself, and negotiated new terms with the linen supplier that reduced the quarterly bill by a figure Harriet would have found significant had Harriet ever looked at the quarterly bill. Harriet did not look at the quarterly bill. Harriet looked at the seating arrangements and the guest lists and the quality of the flowers, and she expected Penelope to ensure that all of these things were as they should be, without requiring explanation or acknowledgement. There had been one afternoon, about 18 months into her time at Harriet's, when a young woman named Clara, the daughter of one of Harriet's friends, visiting for a week, had found Penelope at the morning room desk and asked, with genuine curiosity, who had taught her to manage accounts. "My father taught me the structure," Penelope had said. "The rest I taught myself." Clara had looked at her with an expression of uncomplicated admiration that was so unfamiliar, Penelope had not known what to do with it for several seconds. "That seems extraordinary," Clara had said. "It seems ordinary to me," Penelope had replied, and meant it. Someone had to know. She had been seen, in that moment, the way she was not usually seen, not as a useful arrangement, not as a necessary background function of someone else's household, but as a person who had made herself capable of something real. It had lasted the length of the morning. Then Clara had left, and Harriet had come in to ask about the table linens, and Penelope had returned to her list. She was not unaware of what she had become. She understood that the world had a category for women like her, capable, overlooked, absorbed into the machinery of other people's domestic lives, with no more ceremony than a piece of furniture that happened to be well made. She did not accept this category in the private architecture of her own thinking, though she was precise enough to recognize that her refusal to accept it did not change the room she was standing in. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. Edmund Cavendish had been Duke of Cavendish for 11 years, and he had spent 8 of them trying to understand what his mother had been trying to build before she died. The estate at Cavendish Park, 600 acres in Wiltshire, a house that required 34 staff to run at half capacity, and a tenant infrastructure that had been efficiently organised and then left to drift for nearly a decade, had been his mother's primary occupation for the last 10 years of her life. She had managed it with what he now understood was the systematic attention of someone working against time. She had died when Edmund was 22, 3 months after he inherited the title from his father, and the estate she had left behind showed her hand everywhere. In the tenant agreements she had revised, in the drainage project she had half completed, in the music room she had refurnished, for reasons she had not explained to anyone. Edmund had not been a neglectful duke. He had engaged competent solicitors and capable estate managers. He had honoured his mother's tenant agreements. But he understood, with the private honesty of a man who examines his own record without sentimentality, that he had been maintaining rather than completing, and that there was a difference. His solicitor, a man named Edward Sayers, who had served the Cavendish estate for 23 years and had known Edmund's mother before Edmund knew how to read, had brought the matter to a head in March of 1819 in terms Edmund could not dismiss. The drainage project, left unfinished, was now producing measurable losses in the northern quarter of the tenant farms. The estate accounts, well kept on the surface, had a structural inefficiency that Sayers described as a recurring fracture, Your Grace, of the kind that widens. The estate needed not a new solicitor, but a new approach to its management, someone who understood the whole picture, not merely the individual lines of it. "You need someone who thinks the way your mother thought," Sayers had said, and then stopped, because he was a careful man who measured his own sentences. Edmund had considered this for 8 days. Then he had asked Sayers to make inquiries. The inquiry had returned, after 3 weeks, with a name he did not recognize in a context he had not expected. The report was thorough. It described a woman who had managed a debt-burdened estate in Shropshire for 4 years without legal authority or financial recognition, had recovered the estate from a position that 2 creditors had privately described as terminal, and had subsequently been managing a London household's finances with a precision that the household's own solicitor, when discreetly consulted, called, with visible reluctance, exemplary. She was unmarried, 26, without connections of consequence, and had no formal title or standing that would make her appointment to anything comprehensible to a social audience. Edmund had read the report twice, and then set it aside and walked to the music room, which he did when he needed to think without interruption. The room still smelled faintly of his mother's preferred candle, though it had been 11 years, and he did not permit himself to examine why he had kept the same supplier. The report had not told him she was the right choice. Reports did not tell you things like that. But it had told him something specific, that the quality of her judgment, under conditions that would have crushed most people, had held, and that the work she had been done with no audience, no acknowledgement, and no guarantee. He found this significant. He had encountered many capable people in the course of 11 years of managing the largest estate in Wiltshire. He had never encountered someone who had been that capable in that much silence. He had attended the Ashfield House ball because Sayers had mentioned, in his careful way, that Penelope Ashworth would be there. Edmund had intended to observe her. He had not intended to find himself turning in a doorway to watch a woman in a grey dress correct a seating arrangement with the focused efficiency of someone who did not know, and would not have cared, that she was being watched by a duke. He had stood in that doorway for a longer moment than was strictly necessary, and then he had gone to fulfill his social obligations with the particular patience of a man who has decided something and is waiting for the appropriate moment to act on it. 3 nights before the Ashfield ball, he had stood in the corridor outside the music room at Ashfield House. He had arrived 2 days early at the invitation of Harriet's husband, a business association, and had been given a room in the East Wing. He had not been able to sleep. At 11:30, he had heard music. It was not fashionable music. It was not the kind of piece a young woman would perform in a drawing room to demonstrate accomplishment. It was something older and more deliberate, played with the particular intimacy of a person who was playing for themselves and had forgotten to account for the acoustics of the house. He had stood in the corridor for 40 minutes without moving, and had not announced himself, and had gone back to his room when the music stopped. He had stood there again the 2nd night, and the 3rd. On the 3rd night he had understood that he was not there to assess her anymore. He had already made his decision. He was there because the music was the most honest thing he had heard in 3 years of social obligations, and he was not yet ready to give it up. He asked for an introduction the following morning through Sayers, who handled it with the practiced discretion of a man who had been managing difficult requests for 23 years. Penelope came to Cavendish Park in the first week of April 1819, and she came alone, which was not strictly proper, but was strictly necessary, because the position Edmund was offering her had no established category, and therefore no established protocol. She had read the letter of appointment 3 times, and then set it on the desk and looked at it for some time. It offered her the management of the Cavendish estate accounts, reporting to the Duke of Cavendish and to Sayers jointly, with a salary that was nearly 3 times what she had ever seen in any formal arrangement, and terms that included her own rooms, her own access to the estate records, and the explicit authority to renegotiate any tenant or creditor agreement she found wanting. She had spent one evening thinking about what it meant, and one morning thinking about what it cost, and on the 2nd morning she had written her acceptance in a single precise paragraph. She had not written it because it rescued her. She had written it because it was real work with real authority, and she had been doing real work without real authority for long enough to know the difference. Sayers met her at the door of Cavendish Park, with the manner of a man who has been waiting longer than he intended to, and is trying not to show his relief. He was 63, with the careful reserve of a senior solicitor who had seen enough human difficulty to find competence moving when he encountered it. He showed her the estate records within the first hour. The housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Marsh, met her with a different kind of reception. She was a woman of 50, broad-shouldered and watchful, and she had the practical domestic intelligence of someone who had been running the household infrastructure of a large estate for 20 years and knew exactly which parts of it were fraying. She showed Penelope her rooms, not the best rooms, but respectable ones, with a window that looked over the kitchen garden, and then showed her where the linen was kept, and then said, with the directness of someone who had made up her mind already, "You'll want tea before you start on those account books, and you'll want it strong." Penelope had found, in that small specific offer, the first genuine warmth she had encountered since arriving. She had found also that she was grateful for it in a way she had not anticipated. The estate's problems were not catastrophic. They were structural, which was in some ways worse, the kind of difficulty that does not present as a crisis and therefore does not get treated as one until it has been quietly widening for long enough that the remediation is twice the work it would have been. She spent the first 3 days with the account books and found 4 distinct inefficiencies, 2 of which Sayers had identified and 2 of which he had not. She found the drainage project records in the bottom of a filing chest and spread them across the library table and worked backward through 4 years of decisions to understand what the project had originally intended. By the end of the first week, she had a written assessment. By the end of the second, she had a plan, with specific costs and timelines attached. Edmund reviewed the assessment on a Thursday evening. He had expected something competent. He had not expected something this thorough. 41 pages, annotated in the margins with every alternative considered, the reasoning for each rejection, the figures supporting each recommendation. He read it in one sitting, and then turned back to the beginning and read the annotations. He brought the document to the library the following morning, where Penelope was working at the long table with 3 account ledgers open beside her. "There is a clause on page 22, he said, regarding the northern drainage. You have suggested a cost-sharing arrangement with the Hartley estate to the north. Did Sayers tell you about the Hartley dispute?" "No," Penelope said. "I found the boundary records from 1807. The dispute is over drainage rights that the Hartley estate has been claiming informally for 12 years, without a formal agreement ever being written. The cost-sharing arrangement would resolve the dispute and finance the project at 60% of what Cavendish would spend alone." He set the document on the table. "It would require the Hartley estate's agreement. Yes, I have drafted a letter of proposition. It is on page 31. He turned to page 31. He read the letter. He set the document down again and looked at her for a moment, with the measuring attention that she had noticed on the evening of the ball, and had since learned to recognize as his default mode of engagement when he encountered something that required recalibration. "You've been doing this for 8 years, he said. It was not quite a question. 4 at Marlow House, 4 at my cousin Harriet's, 8 in total, yes. Without, he said, and then stopped. Without anyone knowing, she said. That is the usual observation. He did not look away. I was going to say without adequate instruments. The Marlow estate records your solicitor reviewed described accounts that had been maintained under considerable constraint." She looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who has not been seen clearly in a long time and is not yet certain what to do about it. "It was cold," she said, "but it was manageable." He did not say anything. He simply picked up the document, tucked it under his arm, and left the library. The following morning, the letter to the Hartley estate went out over his signature, with the specific clause structure Penelope had drafted intact. She had not been told it was going. She found out when Sayers mentioned it, with what she recognized as his version of pleasure, a slight easing of the careful lines around his eyes. Lady Cecily Fairmont arrived at Cavendish Park on a Thursday, 11 days into Penelope's tenure, with her mother and the general atmosphere of someone who considers an arrival its own form of announcement. She had been invited for the county party, a social obligation Edmund maintained each spring with the resigned regularity of a man honouring his own standing. She took in the house in one experienced sweep, and then took in Penelope, whom she encountered in the entrance hall, going over the guest seating with Mrs. Marsh, with a second sweep of a rather different character. "This is your account, woman," she said to Sayers, who was nearby, and immediately wished he were not. "Miss Ashworth is managing the estate accounts," Sayers said carefully. "How diverting," Lady Cecily said, with a smile that was doing several things at once, and none of them generous. She turned to Penelope directly. "Do you find it very confining, being shut up with ledgers all day? I should find it completely impossible." "The ledgers are not confining," Penelope said. "They are informative. I have found, for example, that the Cavendish estate has been overpaying its London wine merchant by approximately £40 annually for the past 3 years, which I expect will be of interest to His Grace's household accounts." There was a pause. "How remarkable," Lady Cecily said, with the exact tone of someone who does not find it remarkable. "It is not remarkable," Penelope said pleasantly. "It is arithmetic." She returned to the seating list. Lady Cecily moved on. Sayers, who had been looking at the middle distance with professional intensity, exhaled very slightly. The county party lasted 4 days. Lord Fairmont, Lady Cecily's father, a man who wore his baronetcy with the aggrieved distinction of someone who considers himself consistently undervalued by a universe that should know better, had attached himself to Edmund's side with the comfortable certainty of a man who believes he understands the situation. He was 61, broad, with the particular bluntness that certain men of his generation mistook for directness. "I understand you have engaged a woman to manage your accounts," he said to Edmund on the second afternoon, in the tone of a man making a statement that is also a diagnosis. "I have engaged someone with an extraordinary command of estate management," Edmund said, "who happens to be a woman, yes." "Irregular," Lord Fairmont said. "You understand how it appears." "I understand that the Northern Drainage Project, which has been losing the estate approximately £240 annually for 4 years, has now been fully resourced and contracted," Edmund said. "I find that more relevant than its appearance." Lord Fairmont pursed his lips. "You are the Duke. You will do as you see fit. I am merely observing that these things have structural implications." He paused. "Cecily is very accomplished." "Lady Cecily is accomplished in a number of ways," Edmund agreed, with the patient finality of someone ending a conversation that has mistaken itself for an opening. Lord Fairmont understood, or pretended to understand, and the afternoon continued. What Lord Fairmont had not observed, because he was not paying the kind of attention that produces observation, was that Edmund Cavendish had spent the previous evening in the library until nearly midnight, at the other end of a long table from Penelope Ashworth, who was annotating a new set of tenant agreements, and who had paused once, at 10:30, to push a candle 2 inches to the left so the light fell more directly on his side of the table than her own. He had noticed. He had not said anything, but when he had risen to leave, he had paused at the door and said, very quietly, "You have been here 11 days, and you have already found more in these accounts than my last 3 estate managers found in 11 months, combined." Penelope had set down her pen. They were looking for what was there. I was looking for what was missing. There was a moment that was not quite silence. The fire was still going. The house was not quiet, but that had the quality of a held breath. "Your cravat has been crooked for 40 minutes, she said. "I did not mention it, because we were working, but you are about to go into company." He looked down. The cravat was, in fact, slightly displaced on the left side. He reached up to correct it and failed in the way of a man who cannot see what he is adjusting. She rose from the table, came around to his side, and with 2 brief, precise movements, straightened it. Her hands were efficient and entirely impersonal. She stepped back and returned to her chair. He stood at the door for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said. "It was crooked," she said, and picked up her pen. He had, without making any announcement to anyone, begun to find reasons to be in the library in the evenings. He had also, 3 days after the county party ended and Lady Cecily departed with her mother and her father's structural implications, found Penelope in the garden at dusk, standing at the edge of the kitchen garden, with her arms crossed and her attention fixed on the far wall, with the focused expression of someone solving a problem that has not yet announced itself. "The wall," she said, without turning, though she had heard him on the gravel path. "It is listing, the east section. If it goes, it will take the cold frames and approximately £400 in winter stores." He looked at the wall. He could see, now that she had named it, the slight departure from true that she had identified. "How long?" "Sayers thinks before spring. I think before Christmas." She paused. "I have the name of a mason in the village who repaired the Hartley boundary wall last year. The estimate I have in mind is £8. He was silent for a moment. "You drafted the Hartley letter, you completed the drainage assessment, you found the wine merchant overpayment, and now you are saving my kitchen garden wall. Someone has to look at the wall," she said. It was the same thing she had said, years ago, to a girl named Clara in Harriet's morning room, and it was just as true now. She turned, finally, to look at him. "I am paid to look at the wall, Your Grace." "Edmund," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "That is not appropriate." "No," he said. "It is not." He looked at the wall again. "Get the mason." The mason came the following Tuesday. By Friday, the wall was sound. Penelope wrote the £8 into the household accounts with the description, "Structural repair, East kitchen garden wall," and added a margin note in her own copy that read, simply, "Before Christmas." I was right. She had found, in these weeks, that Cavendish Park was beginning to feel like something she had not encountered in a long time. A house where her work had weight. Not invisible labour that disappeared into the smooth functioning of other people's lives, but traceable, accountable, consequential work. She had also found, with the caution of someone who has learned not to count on things that merely look like rescue, that she was watching herself feel settled and was uncertain what to trust about it. The complication arrived in the form of a letter from her uncle Gerard. It arrived in the second week of May, forwarded by Harriet's housekeeper. Penelope read it twice, and then sat with it for a long time. Gerard had written to inform her that Marlow House had received an offer from a property speculator, a man named Crawford, who was acquiring tenant land throughout Shropshire, and that he intended to accept the offer, which would require the formal dissolution of the estate. Thomas, now 18, would receive a small sum. Penelope would receive nothing, because she had nothing legally to receive. She had managed that estate for 4 years. She had records of every decision, every renegotiated agreement, every creditor payment. None of it gave her any legal claim. She sat with this for one evening, and then put the letter in her document case, and wrote 3 letters. One to Gerard's solicitor, one to the creditor, whose agreement she had renegotiated in 1813, and who she believed would have a view on the sale, and one to Thomas, who did not know about the offer yet, and needed to. She did not tell Edmund. It was not relevant to her work at Cavendish Park, and she was not in the habit of making her personal difficulties a claim on other people's attention. She had managed the Marlow situation, and the Harriet situation, and 4 years of cold winters and creditor letters, and the quiet, constant hum of invisible labour, and she could manage this. She told herself this in the specific, factual way. She told herself things that needed to be true. The letter to Gerard's solicitor was precise, documented, and strategically timed. She knew from the creditor records that Crawford's offer, while financially sufficient, had a condition attached that would restrict the land use in ways that would damage 2 of the tenant farmers' livelihoods. She presented this in the letter not as a moral objection, She knew from experience that moral objections to land sales were rarely decisive, but as a legal complication that would expose Gerard to a counterclaim from the affected tenants, this was not a threat, it was information. She also wrote to the creditor, a wool merchant in Shrewsbury named Alderton, who had been, in her assessment, a man of rough justice, and enclosed a copy of the renegotiated 1813 agreement with a note explaining the proposed sale and its timing. Sayers found her in the library on the third day of this, when he arrived to review the Hartley response, and said nothing for a moment when he saw the volume of correspondence on her side of the table, in addition to the estate work. "Personal matter," she said, without looking up. "It will not affect the estate schedule." "I did not imagine it would," Sayers said, and sat down. He reviewed the Hartley response in silence for 10 minutes. Then he said, as though remarking on the weather, "The Marlow estate, in Shropshire, the one from the report." Penelope set down her pen. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone making a decision. "Yes." "Crawford," Sayers said. "He has made 3 similar acquisitions in the past year. 2 of the affected tenant families sought legal remedy. Neither succeeded." He paused. "If there is documentation of the original estate's creditor agreements, properly organised, the question of tenant protections becomes a matter of recorded intent, not merely assertion." "I have the documentation," Penelope said. "I thought you might," Sayers said, and returned to the Hartley response. He did not explain her to anyone. He simply said, 2 days later, when Edmund asked about a particular set of files that Sayers had sent to London, "Miss Ashworth's work. She is addressing a property matter in Shropshire that has implications for several tenant families." Edmund said nothing. He attended to the files on his own desk. 3 days later, he mentioned to Penelope, in passing, that he had a colleague at the Inns of Court whose particular area was property law and tenant protections, and that if she ever had need of a reliable name, he could provide one. She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. It was the same 2 words he had said to her about the cravat, and they had approximately the same weight as that exchange had had, which was more weight than 2 words usually carried. The matter with Crawford resolved itself over 6 weeks, not dramatically, but decisively. The documented creditor agreements, combined with Alderton's formal objection to the timing of the sale and the legal complication Penelope had outlined to Gerard's solicitor, produced a situation in which Crawford's offer became less attractive than it had initially appeared. The speculator withdrew. Gerard, confronting this outcome without entirely understanding how it had been produced, wrote to Penelope with the specific tone of a man who suspects he has been outmaneuvered, but cannot identify the point at which it happened. She wrote back a courteous reply and said nothing further. Thomas wrote to say that he had heard, through a friend of Gerard's, that the sale had fallen through and the estate was stable. He wrote, "I know this was you. It is always you. I wish someone else knew that too." She kept that letter in the same case as her father's. The formal difficulty came in June, when Lord Fairmont returned to the county, not for a party this time, but with the specific intention of a conversation with Edmund that he described to Edmund's secretary as a matter of considerable importance. He arrived on a Monday. By Tuesday afternoon, Edmund had heard the full scope of it. Fairmont considered the presence of a woman in the role of estate account manager, operating with the visibility and authority that Penelope now had at Cavendish Park, to be a matter that reflected on the ducal standing in ways that could not be indefinitely ignored. He had brought with him, this was the part Sayers reported to Penelope, with the careful expression of someone delivering difficult information precisely, a letter, signed by 4 of the local landowners, expressing similar concern. The letter stopped short of any formal objection. It was, as social pressure often was, a structure built to make its message felt, without ever being accountable for it. Lady Cecily had not signed the letter, but she had arrived with her father. Penelope heard this and sat with it for a moment. Then she picked up her list and returned to the morning's work. She was not surprised. She had known, from the first week, that this world had rules about what she was and where she was allowed to stand. She had not come to Cavendish Park expecting the world to rearrange itself. She had come because she had been offered real work with real authority, and she had done that work, and the results were in the accounts. She drafted nothing. She prepared nothing. She went to the library and laid out, on the long table, the documentation of everything she had done in the past 11 weeks, the drainage plan and its cost projection, the Hartley correspondence and its resulting agreement, the wine merchant recovery, the mason's receipt for the kitchen garden wall, the tenant agreement revisions, and the revised quarterly accounts showing the current projected surplus against the previous year's baseline. She did not bring this to Edmund. She did not present it to anyone. She laid it out because it was hers, and she wanted it organized. Edmund came to the library that evening, as he had been doing. He found the table set with everything she had produced in 11 weeks, arranged in order of date and category, and found Penelope sitting at the far end with her hands folded and her spine straight, and a look on her face that was not anger and was not distress, but was something older and quieter than either, the particular stillness of someone who has been here before and knows exactly what they are doing. "Lord Fairmont," she said. "And the letter?" "Yes," Edmund said. "I assumed Sayers would mention it." He did. Edmund came to the table and stood for a moment looking at the documentation laid out across it. He did not pick anything up. He looked at it the way he had looked at the 41-page assessment, with the attention of someone reading something that requires more than a surface pass. "This is not a petition," Penelope said. "I am not presenting this to you. I organized it because it required organization." "I know," he said. "If Lord Fairmont's view prevails," she said, with the measured precision of someone choosing words for accuracy and not for comfort, "I will leave. I will take my records and my annotated accounts, and I will leave. And I will find the next place that needs someone who can see what is missing. That is what I do. I have been doing it for 8 years, and I have never needed to petition anyone to recognize it." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire was going. The candles on the table were burning low on her side from the evening's work and bright on his. "There is no hearing," he said. "No counsel, no formal inquiry. Lord Fairmont and his letter are a social pressure, not a legal one." He paused. "I am proposing to convert the estate account management role into a formal position with a written contract, a salary schedule, and terms that do not require my personal goodwill to be legally binding. That is the answer to Lord Fairmont's structural concern, not your removal, but your establishment." She looked at him. "That is a considerable commitment for a duke to make." "It is a reasonable response to demonstrated quality," he said. The pause that followed was not quite silence. "There is a second matter," he said, and his voice had changed in a way she could not immediately categorize. "I am going to speak to Lord Fairmont tomorrow. I am going to tell him that the letter is not a view I share and is not a view that will change the estate's direction. And I am going to tell him something else, which I would like to tell you first." She waited. "I should like to propose," he said. "Not for social reason, not for convenience, and not because the role of estate manager requires any such arrangement. Because I have not been in the same room as someone I could not afford to lose since my mother died. That is not an eloquent explanation, but it is the accurate one." She was still for a long moment. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, completely and without hurry, accounting for the weight of each element. "You have known me 11 weeks, she said. "I have known the quality of your work for 11 weeks, he said. "I have known that you are the person you are for somewhat longer. I stood in the corridor outside the music room for 3 nights. The candle on the table between them burned steadily. "You stood there while I played," she said. It was not a question. "3 nights, he said. Another pause. "I knew there was someone there," she said. "I played differently on the 3rd night, more carefully." "I noticed," he said. She looked at the table of documents. She looked at the fire. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the table, the solid wood of it, which was real and definite. And then she said, quietly and without drama, "Yes. I will think about it, and my answer will be yes." He did not reach for her hand. He looked at her with the particular attention he had given her from the first evening, and she looked back at him, and there was nothing performed in either direction. "Then I will speak to Lord Fairmont in the morning," he said. Lord Fairmont had come prepared, in the way of men who have organised their positions before they arrive, and expect the organising to be the difficult part. He sat in the drawing room at Cavendish Park, with the letter in his hand, and Lady Cecily beside him, and the comfortable certainty of someone who understands the structural argument and believes the structural argument will prevail. Edmund arrived with Sayers, which Lord Fairmont had not anticipated. He also arrived, which Lord Fairmont had not anticipated, with a statement that Sayers read from a prepared document, not because Edmund could not have delivered it himself, but because putting it into a document with a date and a signature was the appropriate instrument for the occasion. The statement established the formal contract of estate management for Miss Penelope Ashworth, with the terms Edmund had described the previous evening, effective from the date of her original appointment. It also established, and this was the portion of the document that produced the longest silence, that it was the intention of Edmund Cavendish, Duke of Cavendish, to request Miss Ashworth's hand in marriage, and that he was informing Lord Fairmont of this intention in advance of making any social announcement, out of courtesy to the county's established families, and not, he wished to make clear, because their approval was required. Lord Fairmont read the document. He read it again. "This is highly irregular," he said. "It is," Edmund said. "I find I can live with that." The silence that followed had the quality of a room waiting to find out what it had just become. Lady Cecily, to her credit, said nothing. She looked at her father, and then at the document, and then at a middle distance, and there was something in her face that was not, precisely, surprise, more the particular expression of someone who has been playing a game and has discovered that the other party was not playing the same game, and is now deciding what to do with that information. Lord Fairmont set the document down. He looked at it for a long time with the expression of a man who is reviewing, privately, the position he has taken and the evidence he is looking at, and finding them in imperfect alignment. "I will say this," he said slowly, "and I will say it privately, which is the only way I know how to say it. The work this woman has done for your estate in 11 weeks is more substantial than your previous manager produced in 2 years. My own solicitor mentioned the Hartley arrangement as the most pragmatic resolution of that dispute that anyone had proposed in a decade." He paused. "I had not accounted for that. I was accounting for appearance and not for result. It was not warmth. It was not conversion. It was the particular partial recalibration of a man who has found himself in possession of information that his original position did not incorporate, delivered without apology, but with the deliberate honesty of someone who considers accuracy a form of integrity." "Thank you," Edmund said. Lord Fairmont picked up his hat. "You will do as you see fit. You are the Duke." He looked once more at the document. "She had better be extraordinary." "She is," Edmund said. "She has been for years. We simply failed to look." The formal inquiry convened in the 3rd week of June, in the county assembly rooms in Marlborough, not a court, not quite a council, but a gathering of the 7 principal landowners of the region, called at the instigation of 2 of Fairmont's co-signatories, who had decided, apparently, that a written letter was insufficient, and a formal accounting was required. They had framed it as a review of the Cavendish estate's proposed structural changes, which everyone present understood to be a review of Penelope Ashworth's right to have made them. She arrived with Sayers and with Edmund, who took his seat at the side of the room, and remained there for the entirety of what followed. There were 23 people present. Lady Cecily was not among them. Her father was. The presiding landowner, a man named Hargreaves, 70, the eldest in the room and the one who had been most clearly written into the inquiry's purpose, began by asking Penelope to explain the basis on which she had been operating in the Cavendish estate accounts. She stood. She was wearing dark blue, which she had worn before but not recently. She had her document case. She placed it on the table before her and did not open it immediately. "I have been managing the Cavendish estate accounts since the 2nd of April, she said. "In that period, I have produced a drainage plan at a projected cost of £1,240, funded at 60% through a cost-sharing agreement with the Hartley estate, which resolves a boundary dispute that has been unresolved since 1807. I have recovered approximately £120 in annual overpayments to the London wine merchant. I have directed a structural repair to the kitchen garden wall that will protect approximately £400 in winter stores. I have revised 9 tenant agreements to correct terms that had been degraded by several years of administrative drift. The quarterly accounts for the current period show a projected net improvement of £630 against the previous year's baseline." She opened the document case. "Everything I have described is documented here. The original assessments, the cost projections, the contractor agreements, the tenant agreement revisions, and the before and after figures. I will leave these documents with the Assembly for review. I ask only that anyone who examines them, examine them as they are, as the record of 11 weeks of work, not as the record of an irregularity." She placed the full set of documents on the table and closed the case. The room did not erupt. There was a long, suspended moment in which 23 people were recalibrating at different speeds, and no one wanted to be the first to show how much. Hargreaves reached forward and pulled the top document toward him. He looked at it for a full minute. Then he passed it to his left. The document moved around the table. 41 pages, said one of the co-signatories, who had pulled the drainage assessment. 43, Penelope said, if you include the appendices. Another pause. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. Lord Fairmont looked at his document, the quarterly accounts, and then looked up, once, at Penelope. She met his gaze steadily. Edmund, at the side of the room, said nothing. He watched. His hands were still. Hargreaves, after 17 minutes of review, said, "The documentation appears thorough. The figures, as presented, have no apparent irregularity." He paused. "There is the question of the propriety of the arrangement." "The arrangement is under formal contract," Sayers said, from his position beside Edmund, as of the 14th of June. "I have a copy available for the Assembly's review." Hargreaves looked at Sayers. He looked at Edmund. He looked at Penelope. Edmund rose from his chair. He crossed the room. He came to stand before Penelope's table, and, in full view of 23 witnesses, including Lord Fairmont and the 2 co-signatories, and Hargreaves, and a young clerk who would describe the moment in his diary that night, with the breathless attention of someone who understands they have witnessed something real. Edmund Cavendish, Duke of Cavendish, took Penelope Ashworth's gloved hand and pressed it to his lips. He held it for a moment. Then he released it and straightened and addressed the room. "Miss Ashworth will be the Duchess of Cavendish," he said. "I am informing this assembly not because its approval is required, but because she deserves to have the announcement made before witnesses. She has been doing extraordinary work in silence for 8 years. She will not do it in silence anymore." The room was quiet for a long time. Lord Fairmont set down the quarterly accounts. He pressed his fingers together in front of him and looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, without warmth but without contempt, "The figures are sound. That is the appropriate observation for this assembly to record." Hargreaves nodded. "The record will note that the Cavendish estate management has been reviewed and no financial or administrative irregularity has been identified." Penelope stood still and did not let her expression change, because the thing she was feeling was too large to let out in a room of 23 people, who had just spent 17 minutes deciding whether to be persuaded by her and did not need to see what it cost her to have been required to persuade them at all. She picked up her document case. She returned every gift the world had given her in the wrong spirit, every expectation that she manage herself into smaller dimensions, every arrangement that required her to be brilliant without acknowledgement. She kept, as she always had, her name and her work, and the annotated accounts that could not be argued with. Edmund was beside her when they reached the door. He said nothing. He simply offered his arm, and she took it. The private proposal came 9 days later, in the library, in the evening, when the candles were burning low and the fire had gone to coals, and Penelope was organising the final draft of the Hartley cost-sharing agreement for the solicitor's signature. He had been on the other side of the table, reviewing correspondence. He set down his pen and looked at her for a long time, and she knew he was looking, and went on writing for approximately 60 seconds before she set her own pen down. "I said something to the assembly," he said, which was not entirely the wrong thing to say, but was not the complete thing. "No," she agreed. "The complete thing is this." He was quiet for a moment, gathering the precision that was, she had learned, the way he handled what mattered most to him. "Not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted the requirements my position imposes. Not because the accounts are correct or the drainage plan is extraordinary, or because you are the most capable person I have ever watched work, though all of that is true. But because I stood in a corridor for 3 nights and listened to you play music that you played for yourself, with no audience and no expectation, and I understood something I have not understood since my mother died, that some people simply are what they are, completely, without performing it, and that I had been in rooms full of performance for so long that I had forgotten what the other thing felt like." Penelope sat with this for a full, unhurried minute. "Your mother played," she said. He looked at her. "Yes. The piece I played on the 3rd night. I found it in the music room. It was written in a woman's hand in the score margin. I thought it might have been hers." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "It was." She looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who has been given something they were not expecting and is deciding what it weighs. "I would like to say yes," she said. "Completely, and having thought about it, yes." He did not reach across the table. He rose and came to her side of it and took her hand, her bare right hand, because she had taken her glove off to write, and held it, not dramatically, but with the specific care of a man who understands that this is the thing that matters and intends to hold it accordingly. Outside, the Wiltshire dark had come fully down. The estate was quiet. The kitchen garden wall was sound. The drainage project was under contract. The annotated accounts were in their case, organised and complete, ready for the next thing that needed to be found. They married in October, which was not fashionable, but was practical, before the winter accounts required attention and after the harvest figures were in. Sayers handled the legal arrangements with the visible satisfaction of a man whose recommendation has proven correct. Mrs. Marsh organised the house for the occasion and presented Penelope, on the morning of the wedding, with a set of household keys that had belonged to Edmund's mother, the real ones, not a ceremonial copy. Thomas came from Shropshire. He sat in the front pew and looked at his sister, walking down the aisle, with the expression of someone who has always known a thing and is watching the world catch up to it. Penelope wore ivory because she had chosen it herself, and it fit. The life they built together was not quiet, but it was ordered. The order of a household where the accounts are correct and the decisions are made by people who trust each other's judgment. She expanded the estate management approach to include a formal training structure for tenant farm managers, drawn from the annotated methods she had developed over 8 years, which 3 neighbouring estates had adopted by the end of 1821, after Edmund shared the framework at a county landowners' meeting. The annotated accounts, the original ones, from Marlow House, and from Harriet's, and from the first 11 weeks at Cavendish Park, were kept in a set of bound volumes that lived in the library beside the drainage project records and the revised tenant agreements, because she had always known she might need to account for every shilling, and old habits have their own kind of loyalty. Edmund Cavendish, Duke of Cavendish, the person being written into whatever official histories the county eventually produced, was, in the private architecture of his own household, a man who watched his wife work and found in watching something that had been missing from his life for 11 years. Not drama, not rescue, but the quiet, durable pleasure of being in the company of someone who was exactly what they were. Their son, William Edmund Cavendish, was born in September of 1820 and named for two fathers, which was the kind of decision that required no explanation to anyone who understood both of them. He arrived healthy and loud, which Penelope noted in the household accounts under notable events, with a single precise sentence, and which Edmund received by sitting very still at the side of her bed for a long time with his hand over hers. Their daughter, Eleanor, came 2 years after and was named for the housekeeper who had first offered tea and the specific kind of welcome that does not require ceremony. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's particular way of noticing things, the slight displacement of a wall, the crooked arrangement of a room, the thing that was missing before it announced itself. The morning she turned 4, Eleanor Cavendish climbed onto the library table, walked its entire length, and knocked over an inkwell. Penelope righted the inkwell, lifted her daughter back to the floor, and returned her to the corridor with the serene efficiency of someone who has been managing crises before breakfast for years. Then she returned to the table and blotted the ink. Edmund was watching from the doorway, as he had been watching since she first sat down at that table, and he was not particularly attempting to conceal it. She knew he was watching. She had known, for a long time now, with the particular accuracy she brought to everything, exactly what it meant. She straightened her notes, lifted the next document from the case, and went on.